Before you step into the darkest night of my life, I want you to make a promise. If my story moves you, if the thought of a mother and her children left with nothing makes your blood run cold, please show your support. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. You're not just boosting a video, you're standing with every person who has ever been told they are not enough. Your voice matters. Now listen to what he did. The click of the deadbolt was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a sound of absolute finality, a metallic punctuation mark at the end of my life as I knew it. It echoed in the cold night air, louder than the 8 tiny, whimpering cries bundled in my arms and clustered at my feet. One moment, I was standing on the worn welcome mat of the house I had helped build, the home where I had given birth to all of my children. The next, I was on the outside, staring at the solid oak door that now separated me from everything I had ever known. My daughter's first home was the street. "And Frank, please!" I screamed, my voice shredding as I banged my free hand against the unyielding wood. "Frank, open the door! The babies are cold." And inside, the lights went out, one by one, plunging the house into darkness. He was erasing us. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see his silhouette, a dark, unmoving shape. He was standing there, just on the other side, listening. He was listening to his newborn daughter's cry. He was listening to his wife beg. And he was doing nothing. Just an hour earlier, I had been in our bedroom, my body still weak and trembling from the ordeal of a home birth that had spiraled out of control. I had just delivered our 8th daughter. Our 8th. The midwife had just left, after ensuring we were both stable. Frank had been silent throughout the entire process, his face a grim, unreadable mask. I thought it was shock. I thought it was exhaustion. I was a fool. NHE had waited until the midwife's car disappeared down the long gravel driveway. Then he had walked into the bedroom, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. He didn't look at me, lying in the bed, or at the tiny, perfect infant nestled in the crook of my arm. He looked at our other 7 girls, who had gathered at the doorway, their faces a mixture of awe and concern for their new sister. "Get them dressed," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "And get yourself dressed, now." "What's wrong, Frank?" I asked, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. "Where are we going?" "The baby is only an hour old." "You are going," he said, finally looking at me. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was something far worse. It was revulsion. "I told you, Sarah. I told you I couldn't take another one. I can't do this. I can't live in a house overflowing with women. I need a son. I need a legacy. You gave me this sorority house, so you can take them and you can leave." It didn't feel real. It was like a scene from a nightmare, surreal and terrifying. I protested, I cried, I begged. He was unmoved. He herded our 7 older daughters, who were weeping in confusion, towards the front door. He grabbed the new baby from my arms, wrapped her hastily in a blanket, and thrust her back at me as I stumbled after them. He pushed us out onto the porch, our bare feet cold on the rough concrete. And then he closed the door, and the deadbolt clicked into place. NSO, there I stood, in the cold autumn night, wearing nothing but a thin nightgown, holding a 1-hour-old infant. My 7 other daughters, the oldest only 10, huddled around me, their small bodies shaking with cold and fear. We had nothing, no shoes, no coats, no phones, no money. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The world was a vast, dark, and terrifying place. He hadn't just kicked us out, he had sentenced us to death. And as the reality of our situation crashed down on me, a new feeling began to smolder beneath the terror. It was rage, a white-hot, protective fury. He thought he could throw us away like trash. He thought we were weak. He thought he could break me. Standing there in the darkness, surrounded by the precious lives he had discarded, I made a vow. We would survive. and I would not rest until the entire world knew what Frank Miller, the good, simple, hardworking man, had done to his family. His betrayal wouldn't be a secret buried in the dark. It would be a fire that would burn his world to the ground. Frank Miller was not a complicated man. That was his greatest appeal. In a world that felt increasingly chaotic, he was a bastion of simplicity and tradition. I met him in our small rural town, a place where family names meant something and roots ran deep. I was a school teacher, content with my life of books and lesson plans. He was a carpenter, a man who built things with his hands. He had a slow, easy smile and a quiet confidence that I mistook for strength. He smelled of sawdust and honesty. NHE promised me a simple life. A small farmhouse on a few acres of land, a vegetable garden, a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree, and a handful of kids running around in the yard. It was a humble, beautiful dream, and it was my dream too. My parents, who had lived in the same town their whole lives, adored him. "He's a good man, Sarah," my father had said, clapping Frank on the back. "Salt of the earth. You can build a life on a foundation like that." And I believed him. I saw Frank's traditional values not as rigid, but as reliable. He believed a man's job was to provide and protect, and a woman's job was to nurture and create a home. It felt safe. It felt right. We married in the little white church on Main Street and bought a rundown farmhouse on the edge of town. For the first year, we were blissfully happy. We poured our sweat and love into that house, restoring it board by board. Frank's hands, which were so strong and capable, were also gentle when they held mine. He was building our future, and I loved him for it. NTHE first crack in that foundation appeared when I was pregnant with our first child. We were both thrilled, but Frank's excitement had a specific focus. "It's going to be a boy," he'd say with certainty as he built a crib from solid oak. "I'll teach him everything my dad taught me, how to hunt, how to fish, how to build things. A man needs a son to pass his skills down to." His words were filled with a nostalgic longing that was both sweet and unsettling. When I'd gently remind him, "It might be a girl, you know," his smile would tighten. "Nah," he'd say, shaking his head. "It'll be a boy." When our daughter Lily was born, I was lost in a sea of love. She was perfect. Frank held her, his expression clouded. "Well," he said, his voice strangely flat, "she's healthy. That's what matters." The disappointment was a quiet but persistent hum in the background of our joy. He was a good father to Lily. In a practical sense, he provided for her. He built her a beautiful dollhouse. But the spark, the deep paternal pride he spoke of, was missing. NTWO years later, I was pregnant again. This time, the pressure was more explicit. "We need a little brother for Lily," he'd say. "A boy to balance things out." It became his singular focus. He started talking about his grandfather, who had 5 sons, and what a strong family they were. When our second daughter, Clara, was born, something shifted in him. He didn't hold her at all in the hospital. He stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot. "2 girls," he muttered, as if it were an unsolvable problem. "What am I going to do with 2 girls?" NTHE simple life he had promised began to feel restrictive, like a cage built to his exact specifications. The quiet man I married became a silent, brooding presence. The silence in our home was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with unspoken judgment. He started working longer hours, taking on projects far from home. When he was there, his words were clipped, his temper short. He never hit me, but he would punch walls, his frustration a violent, contained explosion that terrified me. I tried to talk to him, to understand this deep-seated need. "My dad always felt like a failure because he only had me," he admitted once, his voice low and bitter. He said a man's name dies with a daughter. It's not right. It's not natural. It was a poison passed down through generations, a toxic belief that a man's worth was measured by the gender of his children. And over the next several years, our family grew. And with each birth, the pattern repeated. A daughter. And another. And another. After our 7th girl, Grace, was born, something in him broke. He became a stranger in our home, a resentful boarder. He stopped eating dinner with us. He spent his evenings in his workshop, the sound of his saw and hammer a constant angry noise. The love and partnership we once shared had completely eroded, replaced by my desperate attempts to manage his moods and his cold, bitter resentment. When I discovered I was pregnant for the 8th time, I was filled with a profound sense of dread. I didn't tell him for weeks. I couldn't bear to see the flicker of desperate hope in his eyes, knowing it would almost certainly be extinguished and that its dying light would burn me. The day I finally told him, he just stared at me, his face pale. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked out of the room. Later that night, I heard him in his workshop, smashing things. That was when I knew. This baby, our 8th child, would be the last straw. One way or another, this pregnancy would be the end of us. N-T-H-E-8th. Pregnancy was a lonely, silent journey. Frank treated me like a ghost in our own home. He stopped speaking to me altogether, communicating only through our daughters with clipped, necessary messages. "Tell your mother I'll be late," or "Tell your mother we need milk." The girls, even the youngest ones, could feel the oppressive weight of his anger. They would tiptoe around him, their laughter and chatter dying on their lips the moment he entered a room. Our home, once a place of warmth and chaos, became a tense, quiet prison. And I clung to a desperate, foolish hope that this baby would be a boy. I prayed for it, not for Frank's sake anymore, but for my own. I thought a son might be the only thing that could save my family, the only thing that could bring back the man I had married. I refused to find out the gender, telling myself it was because I wanted a surprise, but the truth was, I was too terrified to know. I was living on borrowed time, and the truth was a bomb I wasn't ready to detonate. As my due date approached, I decided on a home birth. The hospital felt cold and clinical, and frankly, we couldn't afford it. Frank's carpentry business had been struggling, a fact he blamed on the distractions at home. More than that, I wanted to bring this baby into the world in the house we had built together, as a final, desperate plea to the universe to heal our family. I hired a local midwife, a kind, experienced woman named Mary, who had delivered half the babies in our county. NTHE night I went into labor, Frank was in his workshop as usual. I had to send Lily, my oldest, to go and get him. He came into the house, wiping grease from his hands, his face impassive. He stood in the corner of the bedroom as Mary guided me through the contractions, his presence a cold, useless anchor in the room. He didn't hold my hand. He didn't offer a word of encouragement. He just watched, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. NTHE birth was long and difficult. After hours of exhausting labor, our 8th child finally entered the world. A beautiful, healthy baby with a full head of dark hair. Mary cleaned her up and laid her on my chest. "You have another beautiful daughter, Sarah," she said, her voice soft. NTHE words hung in the air. Another daughter. I looked at Frank. For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It looked like pain, a deep, profound agony. Then it was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness. He turned and walked out of the room without a word. Mary stayed for another hour, making sure the baby and I were both stable. She helped me get cleaned up and settled in bed, with my newborn nestled beside me. She looked at the empty doorway where Frank had disappeared. "He's just overwhelmed, dear," she said, trying to be reassuring. "It's a lot to take in. He'll come around." But I knew better. This was not the reaction of an overwhelmed man. This was the reaction of a man who had just received his final verdict. And after Mary left, the house fell into a deep, unsettling silence. My other 7 daughters, who had been staying in the living room, crept to the bedroom door, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They wanted to see their new sister. I beckoned them in, and they gathered around the bed, their small hands gently touching the baby's head, their whispers a sweet, loving chorus. NTHAT was the scene Frank walked in on. Me, in our bed, holding our 8th daughter, surrounded by our other 7 girls. He looked at us, a room full of females, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. That was when he told me to get dressed. That was when he herded my weeping children out of the room. That was when he pushed us out into the cold, dark night and locked the door behind us, sealing our fate with the cold, hard click of the deadbolt. He hadn't just left us. He had thrown us away. The cold was the first enemy. It seeped through my thin cotton nightgown and into my bones, a deep, aching chill. The baby in my arms, whom I had already named Hope, began to cry, a thin, weak wail that tore at my soul. My other girls huddled around me, their teeth chattering, their small faces pale in the faint moonlight. We were a tiny, pathetic island of humanity in a vast, indifferent wilderness. And panic was a physical thing, a clawing beast in my throat. My mind raced, searching for a solution, but there were no easy answers. The nearest house was miles away, an impossible distance to walk with 7 young children and a newborn, especially with no shoes and no coats. The main road was a dark, deserted ribbon of asphalt. We were utterly, completely alone. And Mommy, I'm scared, whispered Clara, my second oldest, her voice trembling. Her fear cut through my own panic. I looked at their terrified faces, at their wide, trusting eyes, and I knew I could not fall apart. I was their mother. I was their only hope. I had to be strong. I know, sweetie, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. But we're going to be okay. We just need to stay warm until the sun comes up. We're going to have an adventure. It was a pathetic lie, but it was all I had. And I led them away from the house, away from the dark, accusing windows. I couldn't bear to look at it anymore. We stumbled across the gravel driveway and into the small patch of woods that bordered our property. I remembered an old, dilapidated hunting blind that Frank's grandfather had built decades ago. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. NWE found it nestled among the trees, a small, rickety structure of rotting wood. It was drafty and smelled of damp earth, but it was a barrier against the wind. I settled the girls inside, huddling them together on the dusty floor. I took off my nightgown, leaving me in my underwear and a thin nursing bra, and used it to wrap baby Hope, adding another layer of protection against the cold. The girls, seeing what I had done, began to take off their own pajama tops to help cover their younger siblings. My heart ached with a mixture of pride and despair. They were so good, so resilient. They deserved so much better than this. NWE huddled together in a tight ball of shared body heat, a human nest against the cold. I put the baby in the center, surrounded by her sisters. I told them stories, whispering tales of brave princesses and magical forests, my voice growing hoarse. I sang them every lullaby I knew. I did anything to keep their minds off the cold and the fear. And as the hours crawled by, the cold deepened. The girls, shivering, subsided into a dangerous lethargy. I knew we were in trouble. Hypothermia was a real and present danger. I made them stand up, move around, slap their arms and legs. We did jumping jacks in the tiny, cramped space, our movements clumsy and slow. We had to keep moving. We had to stay awake. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, I heard a sound. A car engine. It was coming down our long, private road. For a moment, my heart leaped with a wild, irrational hope. It was Frank. He had come to his senses. He was coming back for us. And I ran out of the blind, waving my arms, my voice a raw croak. "Frank, we're here!" The car, an old, beat-up pickup truck, slowed to a stop. The driver's side door opened, but it wasn't Frank who got out. It was a man I vaguely recognized, a poacher named Bill, who was known in town for his surly demeanor and his disregard for the law. He had been caught trespassing on our land before. NHE stared at me, at my half-naked, shivering form, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mrs. Miller?" "What in God's name are you doing out here?" And tears streamed down my face as the story tumbled out of me, a torrent of grief and rage. I told him what Frank had done. He listened, his hard face unreadable in the glare of his headlights. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment. He looked past me, at the hunting blind where my 7 other daughters were peeking out, their faces like pale, frightened moons. NHE let out a long, low whistle. "I never liked Frank Miller," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Always thought he was a sanctimonious jerk. But I never figured him for a monster." He took off his own thick, flannel-lined jacket and wrapped it around my shoulders. It was warm and smelled of wood smoke. "Come on," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Let's get you and your girls out of the cold." He helped me gather my children, his large, rough hands surprisingly tender as he lifted the younger ones into the warm cab of his truck. He turned the heat on full blast and wrapped them in old blankets he had in the back. As we drove away, I looked back at the dark, silent house one last time. It was no longer my home. It was a tomb, a monument to a dead dream. My daughter's first home had been the street, but thanks to the kindness of a man I barely knew, it would not be their last. And Bill didn't take us to the police. He didn't take us to the hospital. He took us to the one place in our small town that was always open and always warm, the 24-hour diner on the highway. He led us inside, a strange procession of a rough-looking man, a half-dressed, disheveled woman, and 8 shivering children. The few late-night patrons and the waitress, a woman named Flo, stared at us, their mouths agape. NFLO, a woman in her 60s with a cloud of white hair and a no-nonsense attitude, took one look at us and sprang into action. "For heaven's sake, Bill, what have you got here?" she exclaimed, bustling over. "Get them in a booth." Now NSHE disappeared into the back and returned with blankets from her own car and the lost and found box. She wrapped each of my daughters in a warm, if mismatched, cocoon. She brought us hot chocolate and warm milk, her hands, wrinkled and stained with coffee, moving with a swift, practiced efficiency. She didn't ask questions. She just saw a family in need and acted. And Bill sat with us, nursing a cup of black coffee, his presence a silent, protective barrier. He had called the sheriff from the diner's payphone, his voice low and angry. "You need to get down here, John. Frank Miller just tried to kill his family." Sheriff John Brody arrived 20 minutes later. He was a man I had known my whole life, a man who had coached my softball team in elementary school. He looked at me, at my children, and his kind face hardened with a mixture of pity and fury. I told him the story again, my voice stronger now, fueled by the warmth and the hot chocolate. He listened, his jaw tight, taking notes in a small, worn notebook. When I finished, he knelt down in front of my oldest daughter, Lily. "Lily," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened?" Lily, her face streaked with dried tears, looked at me. I nodded. She told him in her simple, 10-year-old words how her daddy had pushed them out of the house and locked the door. Her testimony, so pure and unadorned, was more damning than anything I could have said. And Sheriff Brody stood up, his face grim. "Sarah, I'm going to have to take you and the baby to the hospital to get checked out. The rest of the girls can come with us. We'll find a safe place for you all." He then turned to one of his deputies. "Go out to the Miller place. Arrest him. If he gives you any trouble, you know what to do." NTHE Hospital was a blur of doctors and nurses. Baby Hope was perfectly healthy, a tough little miracle. I was treated for minor exposure, but the deepest wounds were not visible. While I was being examined, the community began to rally. The story had spread like wildfire through the small town's early morning grapevine. Flo, the waitress, had started it. She had called her sister, who called her neighbor, and so on. NBY, the time I was discharged from the hospital a few hours later, a small army of women was waiting for me in the lobby. They were teachers from my school, mothers of my students, women from my church. They had brought bags of clothes, shoes, coats, diapers, and toys. They had collected money. They had found us a place to stay. A retired couple who owned a small motel on the edge of town had offered us 2 of their rooms, free of charge, for as long as we needed. The women descended on the motel, cleaning the rooms, making the beds, and stocking the small kitchenette with food. When I arrived with my daughters, it was a sanctuary. It was warm, it was safe, and it was filled with the love of a community that had refused to let one of its own fall. NTHAT night, tucked into a clean, warm bed, surrounded by my 8 sleeping daughters, I cried. I cried for the life I had lost, for the man Frank had become, for the trauma my children had endured. But I also cried with a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. Frank had left us with nothing, but in doing so he had shown me that we had everything that mattered. We had each other. And we had the kindness of strangers, a force more powerful than his cruelty could ever be. We were not homeless. We were home. And it never mattered. In a small town, news travels fast, but gossip travels faster. In the days that followed our rescue, our town became a divided battlefield of whispers and roars. Frank was arrested and charged with multiple counts of felony child endangerment and abandonment. He was released on bail, paid for by his family, who had lived in the county for generations. And then they went on the offensive. NTHE narrative began to shift. It started in the pews at church, in the aisles of the grocery store, at the counter of the local hardware store. Frank's mother, a stern, unforgiving woman, began to spin a tale of a good man pushed to the brink. Sarah was the one who was obsessed with having children, she'd say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Frank just wanted a simple life. She overwhelmed him. He just snapped. Any man would have. They painted me as a negligent, baby-obsessed shrew who had driven her husband mad. They claimed I was a bad housekeeper, that the home was always a mess, that I had let myself go. They twisted my desire for a large family into a weapon against me. Frank, they argued, was the real victim. He was a man suffering from extreme stress, a man whose dreams had been crushed by a wife who refused to give him a son. It was a vicious, insidious campaign, and it worked on some. People I had known my whole life would cross the street to avoid me. I would see them whispering behind their hands as I walked my girls to the park. The motel owner started getting angry phone calls, pressuring him to kick us out. It was a slow, creeping poison, designed to isolate us, to turn us into outcasts. NBUT, for every whisper, there was a roar. My army of supporters, the women who had rallied around me that first night, refused to let the lies stand. Flo, the diner waitress, became my fiercest defender. She would shut down the gossip in her diner with a sharp word and a withering glare. I saw her that night. She'd tell anyone who would listen. I saw those children. That wasn't a man who snapped. That was a man who tried to murder his family with the cold. Don't you dare defend him in my diner. NMY fellow teachers organized a fundraiser, a bake sale, and a car wash that raised thousands of dollars for our legal defense. Bill, the poacher who had found us, became an unlikely guardian angel. He would show up at the motel with bags of groceries or a new toy for the girls. He even fixed the motel's leaky faucet, grumbling the whole time. NTHE person who roared the loudest was a woman I had never met. Her name was Margaret Quinn, and she was the county's prosecuting attorney. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman from the city, an outsider who wasn't swayed by local politics or family names. She came to see me at the motel, her eyes sharp and intelligent. NSHE listened to my story without interruption. When I was done, she looked at me, her expression firm. "His family is trying to paint you as the villain," she said. "They will say you are unstable. They will use your desire for a family against you. They will try to destroy your credibility. Our job is to make sure the jury sees the truth. And the truth is, he left 8 children, including a 1-hour-old infant, to die in the cold. That is not stress. That is attempted murder." Margaret's plan was simple and brutal. She would use Frank's own deep-seated, traditional beliefs against him. She would prove that this was not a momentary snap, but the culmination of a decade of escalating resentment. She subpoenaed his financial records, his phone records, his internet history. She interviewed his friends, the midwife, and the doctors from my previous deliveries. NMY job, she told me, was to be a mother. To create a stable, loving environment for my children in our 2 small motel rooms. To show the world that we were not broken, we were survivors. And so, we did. Our little motel rooms became a home. The girls drew pictures that we taped to the walls. We made up games. We had dance parties. I read to them every night. In the midst of the whispers and the uncertainty, we created our own world, a fortress built on love and resilience. He had taken our house, but he could not take our home. We were preparing for the fight of our lives, and we were going to win. An NTHE courtroom was small and packed, a microcosm of our divided town. On one side sat Frank, flanked by his parents and an expensive lawyer from the city. He looked smaller than I remembered, his face pale and sullen. He refused to look at me. On the other side sat me, with Margaret Quinn by my side. Behind me, the benches were filled with my army, Flo, Bill, my fellow teachers, the motel owner and his wife. Their presence was a silent, powerful statement. Frank's lawyer was slick and condescending. He did exactly what Margaret had predicted. He painted me as a hysterical, manipulative woman who had entrapped his client in a life he never wanted. He portrayed Frank as a simple, hard-working man who had been pushed beyond his limits. What man wouldn't break under the strain of 8 children? He asked the jury, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. When it was my turn to testify, a hush fell over the courtroom. Margaret led me through the events of that night, my voice quiet but steady. I told the truth. I didn't embellish. I didn't cry. I simply stated the facts. I told them about the cold. I told them about my children's fear. I told them about the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place. And Frank's lawyer's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to twist my words, to make me seem irrational. Isn't it true, Mrs. Miller, that you were the one who insisted on having more and more children, despite your husband's reservations? I wanted a family, yes, I replied, my voice even. So did he. He just wanted that family to look a certain way. Isn't it true that you were angry that night? That you were screaming at my client? I was begging my husband not to leave his children to freeze to death, I said, looking directly at the jury. If that is screaming, then yes, I was screaming. NTHE, key to the prosecution's case, was proving that Frank's actions were not a snap, but a calculated decision born of deep-seated malice. Margaret called a series of witnesses who chipped away at Frank's good man facade. A friend from his hunting club testified that Frank constantly complained about having nothing but girls and had once drunkenly said he'd rather have no kids than a house full of women. The midwife, Mary, testified about his cold, detached behavior during the birth, a stark contrast to his supposed shock later. NBUT, the most powerful evidence was the simplest. Margaret called my 10-year-old daughter, Lily, to the stand. She was terrified, her small hands clenched in her lap. Margaret spoke to her gently, her voice soft and reassuring. She didn't ask about the night itself. She asked about the days before. And Lily, Margaret said, "In the week before your baby sister was born, did your daddy do anything unusual in his workshop?" Lily nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes," she whispered. "He built something. What did he build, sweetie?" "A new door," Lily said, her voice a little stronger. "A big, heavy one, for the front of the house. He put a new lock on it, too. A big, shiny one." And a collective gasp went through the courtroom. Margaret let the words hang in the air for a moment before turning to the judge. "The prosecution has evidence that on the day before the birth, Frank Miller purchased a solid oak door and a heavy-duty, double-keyed deadbolt. He spent the day installing it. This was not a man who snapped. This was a man who planned. He knew the baby was coming, and he was preparing to lock his family out. It was the final, devastating blow. It was premeditated. It was calculated. It was evil." Frank's face went ashen. His mother let out a strangled sob. His lawyer sat down, defeated. NTHE jury was out for less than 20 minutes. The verdict was guilty on all counts. As the word was read, Frank finally looked at me. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a burning, impotent hatred. He had been so sure of his own righteousness, so certain that the world would agree that his desires outweighed our lives. He was wrong. Justice had come for him, and it had been delivered by the weight of a child's testimony and the undeniable truth of a brand new Lock-in-NTHE sentencing was a week later. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, looked at Frank with an expression of utter contempt. "You speak of tradition, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "You speak of legacy. The most fundamental tradition of any civilized society is the protection of its children. You did not just break that tradition, you shattered it. You abandoned your legacy in the cold and the dark. You are a disgrace to the title of father." She sentenced him to the maximum possible term in prison. He would be an old man before he ever saw the outside of a cell again. As he was led away in handcuffs, his parents weeping, I felt not a sense of victory, but a profound sense of peace. The storm was over. Life after the trial was a different kind of challenge, a different kind of beautiful. The town, now united in its support, refused to let us stay in the motel. A local construction company, in partnership with a dozen volunteers, including a grumbling but dedicated Bill, launched a project. They found a small, foreclosed house on a quiet street, and, over the course of a few months, they renovated it for us. They added bedrooms, fixed the roof, painted the walls, and planted a garden in the backyard. The entire town donated furniture, appliances, and everything else we could possibly need. NTHE Day we moved into our new house was one of the happiest days of my life. It wasn't the farmhouse Frank and I had restored. It was smaller, it was simpler, but it was ours. It was a house built, not on a foundation of toxic tradition, but on a foundation of love, kindness, and community. It was a house where my daughters could laugh as loud as they wanted, where they could be themselves without fear. Years passed. My daughters grew, each one a unique and vibrant thread in the beautiful tapestry of our family. They were strong, compassionate, and fiercely loyal to one another. They were artists and athletes, scholars and dreamers. They were living proof that love is a more powerful legacy than any name. And I went back to school and became a family advocate, working for the county to help other women and children navigate crises. I used my experience to fight for others, to be the voice for those who had been silenced. My life had come full circle. One warm summer evening, I was sitting on the back porch of our house, watching my girls, now ranging from teenagers to young adults, play in the yard. They were arguing over a game of badminton, their laughter echoing in the twilight. Lily, my oldest, now a confident young